Hi folks, David Mundy here, filling in for Reverend Isaac for this Sunday as I did last Sunday. He's away on a much deserved vacation, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to offer a reflection again this week, and I hope all of you are well. You might recall last week I told you about my experience 5 years ago this month in the province of Newfoundland. Actually, I was on two small islands off the northeast coast of Newfoundland, adjacent to Fogo Island, called Change Islands. And when I was there, I was studying a document, a theological document or encyclical by Pope Francis called Laudato Si, or Praise Be to You, Care for Our Common Home. And it was an opportunity for me to ponder and consider how we as Christians care for creation, all the creatures, all the systems of creation which are so important to us. It was also an opportunity for silence and solitude. We've gone back there a number of times through the years, and one of the things that we drink in is the different sounds from the hectic sounds of urban and suburban life. And even though at times the waves crash in and the wind howls, nonetheless it's not the same as the noise that we human beings make. Now, I was there this time by myself, and I'll have to admit that even though I appreciated the solitude, there were times when I was lonely too, particularly into the evenings. But it was good for me to be there in that experience. I don't need to tell you that experiencing silence and solitude is increasingly difficult in our noisy world. Even if we've chosen to live away from urban areas or we have a cottage, you could probably tell me your stories of how things are very different now than they were, say, 20 years ago. The Unwanted Sound of Everything We Want is a book by Garrett Kaiser. And it's an appropriate one, don't you think? We have all the things that are supposedly making our lives convenient, all the gadgets and gizmos, but that means that there's seldom a time when it's really quiet anymore. And I've actually been challenged to find a place outside where I can record these Sunday messages without background noise, including the air conditioners, which are going all the time right now. But sometimes it would seem that it's only when we get away from the humming and buzzing and the throbbing of human activity that we realize that the world around us has its own voice. And that voice we interpret as the voice of God, the Creator. The Bible tells us about lots of different people who went out into places where they could be in the silence and solitude in order to hear themselves think and in order to hear God speak. Moses was a shepherd at the time that he had the experience, which we call a theophany, of the burning bush. And then, of course, Elijah, in the midst of the storm, the thunder, the lightning, hears what the King James Version calls the still small voice of God. Near the beginning of Mark's Gospel, Jesus gets up early in the morning, gets away from the crowds who are always around him. And we're told that he goes to a quiet place in order to pray, to commune with God. I'm also thinking of the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well in John's Gospel. And you may have heard that this is the longest exchange between Jesus and any person, the longest conversation between Jesus and any person, the story that we find in John's Gospel. But we also know that Jesus encountered her at midday. It wasn't the usual time for women to gather and draw water. They usually did that in the cool of the morning. But she was an outsider. She was ostracized. And so we can imagine that this woman spent a lot of time alone in her own thoughts with the knowledge of rejection, and Jesus comes to her. But it may be because she spent so much time alone that in fact she was open to the love and the respect which Jesus was offering to her. God often meets us in these moments of solitude, even when they're uncomfortable for us. The story does remind us, though, that enforced solitude and silence can be damaging rather than healing. As you listen to me, you may be thinking to yourself, during this isolation of COVID-19, it's anything but a blessing from God. And for some of you, I know it's been akin to being in a prison cell. Actually, I've been thinking about solitude and prisons lately. Do you know that the first modern prison, so-called modern prison, a penitentiary, had a connection with Quaker Christians in the middle of the 19th century? And the idea behind the penitentiaries was that inmates would be held in virtual solitude and silence, have no contact with others. If they knew how to read, they might be given a Bible to ponder some of the stories, and they could repent of their sins. And so that's how we get the name penitentiary. But sadly, this became an even more severe punishment. And I've certainly seen that the silence and the solitude that I've craved all of my life can be destructive for others at times. Actually, as a 20-something seminary student, I worked in the maximum security Kingston Penitentiary. And my assignment for the summer was visiting the inmates in the solitary confinement cells, which were situated below ground level. They had one small window high up on the wall, heavy doors so that they couldn't see outside. So there I was as a young man in a truly hellish place. And some of the men that I saw lost their minds in isolation because the solitude was too much for them. And even though I did my very best to support them, the enforced solitude as a form of punishment was just too much for them. What we want is for silence and solitude to be our God-given choice, an opportunity to heighten our awareness of ourselves, of the world around us, and of the one who created and redeemed us. When I was alone on Change Islands, I was lonely at times, yet there were moments of great clarity as I read in the silence or walked the rugged shoreline, without those distractions of inner and outer noise. I think most of us are looking forward to being social creatures again, and it can't come too soon. We were so happy as grandparents when we were allowed to bubble with grandchildren again, including our Trenton lads. And when they first came through the door, they talked our ears off. And that happy din was a bit of a shock for us. But we were delighted to have them back in our lives. It's interesting though, last weekend during a visit, both boys said that they'd like to be quiet at times. And perhaps that's part of growing up, of maturity. What do you think? Can silence and solitude be welcome companions on our journey of faith, despite what's been happening in these last few months? I hope so. And perhaps when we can get together again, we can have a conversation together about our favorite places where God speaks to us. There's a hymn in Voices United we don't sing often enough. I like it a lot because it captures the breadth of what silence brings to our lives. The first verse of In the Quiet Curve of Evening says, in the quiet curve of evening, in the sinking of the days, in the silky void of darkness, you are there. In the lapses of my breathing, in the space between my ways, in the crater carved by sadness, you are there. Blessings, everyone.